Now that we understand layering, we can start to see how composites will work. In order to demonstrate this, I'm going to create new composites to help us. So I'm going to hit Control H on my keyboard and create two new composites. On a Mac, that would be Command H. And I'm going to wire the two composites into the bottom one, then the bottom one to the display. Now I will connect the color card to the right side as well as the square. What happens when I connect the square is everything vanishes. The reason for this is these rectangular composites are bitmap comps. And what that means is that it flattens the image together and puts it in one single Z space for display. Effectively, the square and the color card are more ahead than the circle and the triangle at this time. To understand how this works, let's click down on this little square. So bitmap composites are flat composites that take one single Z space. So if you look down in the output option for output Z, this is set to leftmost by default, which means that this composite is getting its Z information from this strand, which is the square, laying at 0, and this composite is getting its Z information from this strand, which is the circle, and the circle is still back there, slightly behind 0. Therefore, the entire composite shows up at the Z space of the circle, whereas the entire composite here shows up as the Z space from the square. An indication is also this highlighted little nub. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to change this to rightmost. As you can see, now the color card and the square are squarely in the back, and the other two geometric shapes are in the front. That's because now the information is being kept from the right color card for this composite. And since the color card is 12 back, that means the square will appear at this Z space, whereas the other two will appear at the circle, which is in front of 12 back. If we wish to maintain the Z space for all nodes, we need to make sure these are set to a pass-through mode. Up here in your mode, you can see that this is set to bitmap. If I click on this, I have three other options that I can choose from. And we're going to switch this to pass-through. What this means is that the Z space for the color card is showing the color card through, and the square is going to go through as well, showing its own Z space at 0. It essentially means that this is just holding everything together for cleanliness, but all the operations are going through. And I'll do the same for this side. Therefore, the triangle is now showing in front of the square, the circle is next, and the color card based on their Z space. So since the square and the triangle are in the same Z space, this composite displays that based on right to left ordering. If I switch these two, then the triangle shows up behind the square, but the color card is still at the same Z space, and the circle is also right here at behind 0. It's kind of a tricky way to understand it, but if you actually spend some time and see how bitmap comps hold one single Z space and pass-through lets everything through, this starts to make sense. If I click on this again, we can just briefly look at seamless bitmap and vector. You primarily will use as bitmap and pass-through. The other two options are mainly used for other things such as vector, which will put everything as a single image that's single vector image only. So any bitmap elements plugged into this, like a TIFF or a PNG, will simply not show outside the composite. A seamless bitmap is used to composite all the images into a flat bitmap as well. But the main difference is that as a bitmap and as seamless bitmap, the seamless version ensures that there's no visible seam between adjacent vector drawings that have matching geometries. So it can be useful for cutout animation where multiple drawings align perfectly like pieces of a puzzle. It can also be used when building 3D sets or flat drawings rotated in 3D. In this case, you might want to use seamless bitmap. But again, generally you will use as bitmap and pass-through for your composites. The output Z here determines what gets recorded as the bitmap Z space. So if I switch this back to bitmap, and I'll plug these in as well, You can see that the highlighted nub is the one determining where the Z space for this entire composite will show. Since it says rightmost, it's grabbing the rightmost. If I switch this to leftmost, the leftmost gets highlighted. I can also choose frontmost or backmost, which will choose whatever Z space is frontmost or backmost in the composite, which is fairly handy if you have several strands going through and you're not sure which one's at the back, but if you want everything pushed back, you choose backmost. Obviously the opposite for frontmost. And lastly, you have port number. If you wanted to choose, say, this strand, you would put in 3, and that would choose the third from the right. This option is fairly rarely used, but you have the option to see it there. We also have a focus and focus multiplier in a bitmap mode. What essentially this does is it tells the camera where the focus is and determines how much blur to apply to the layers if it's not in focus. Lastly, you have a vector palette option, which is only available when you select the vector option, to name a palette and to flatten the vector option as well. Notice that the vector switches to this composite look, whereas a bitmap is a rectangle and a pass-through is a trapezoid. So you can visually see the differences between these composites to help you out.